The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, swirling violently in the wind as James maneuvered his truck down the desolate country road. The headlights barely pierced the darkness ahead, and the wipers struggled to keep up with the relentless storm. He gritted his teeth, adjusting his grip on the wheel. It was the worst blizzard the town had seen in years, and he had been foolish to stay so late at the mechanic shop. Now he was paying for it, driving blind through a frozen wasteland miles away from home. His fingers flexed over the wheel as he glanced at the clock. 10:47 p.m. He sighed. I just need to make it home. But then, something caught his eye. A dark shape just off the road, barely visible against the snow. James squinted. At first, he thought it was just a mound of snow piled against a fallen tree. But as he drew closer, his heart lurched. The shape moved. James slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop, tires crunching over the ice. He threw it into park and grabbed his flashlight. A deep, unsettling feeling curled in his stomach as he stepped out of the cab. The cold bit at his skin instantly, wind whipping against his face, but he barely noticed. Because now, he could hear it. Faint, weak, whimpering. James' chest tightened as he aimed the flashlight toward the dark shape. The beam cut through the swirling snow, and his breath caught in his throat. There, huddled together in a pitiful pile, were 8 tiny puppies. Their bodies shivered violently, half buried in the snow. Their fur was matted with ice, their little faces pressed into one another for warmth. They were alone, abandoned, left to die. James swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had seen stray dogs before, but this was different. Someone had dumped them here, on purpose. A sharp pang of anger rose in his chest, but he forced it down. Now wasn't the time. Right now, those puppies were dying. And if he didn't do something, they wouldn't make it through the night. James made his decision in an instant. He pulled off his jacket and dropped to his knees, scooping the tiny, trembling bodies into his arms. 8 helpless little souls, their eyes wide with fear. James clutched them close, shielding them from the wind. Then, without a second thought, he ran back to the truck. He had no idea what he was going to do next. But one thing was certain. He wasn't leaving them behind. James's heart pounded as he shoved the truck's door open and slid into the driver's seat, cradling the trembling puppies against his chest. The warmth of the truck's heater was a weak contrast to the brutal cold outside, and the puppies barely stirred. They're so cold, too cold. He could feel their tiny bodies shuddering, their fur damp from the melting snow. Some barely moved at all, their breaths so faint they were almost undetectable. His hands tightened around them. No, they're not dying tonight. He quickly unzipped his thick winter coat and tucked them inside, pressing their frail bodies against his own heat. Their tiny paws twitched as they snuggled closer, instinctively seeking warmth. James fumbled to turn up the heat, his fingers shaking, not from the cold, but from urgency. He glanced at the road ahead, barely visible through the windshield. He was still miles from home. The town's small veterinary clinic would be closed at this hour, and even if he could get someone to open it, there was no telling if the puppies had that much time. His only option was to get them home. Fast. Slamming the truck into gear, he pressed the gas pedal. The tires spun against the icy road before catching traction, and he sped forward, his headlights barely cutting through the blinding snowfall. Behind him, the storm howled like a living thing. But in his arms, 8 tiny lives clung desperately to their last shred of warmth. James had never driven this fast in a snowstorm before. Every curve in the road was a risk, every patch of ice a potential death sentence. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was the bundle of life in his coat. Every few seconds, he tilted his head down to check on them. Some of the puppies had stopped shivering entirely, and that terrified him even more. Come on, guys. Hang in there. As his truck skidded onto the final stretch of road leading to his cabin, James caught movement in his rearview mirror. His stomach plummeted. Headlights. A car, partially obscured by the storm, was following him. A bad feeling twisted in his gut. Who the hell was out here at this hour? More importantly, had someone seen him pick up the puppies? He pressed harder on the gas. The truck rumbled up the driveway, skidding slightly as he pulled to a stop in front of his cabin. Without wasting a second, He threw the door open and bolted toward the house, shielding the puppies against the wind. As he reached the porch, the mysterious vehicle slowed to a stop at the bottom of his driveway. James froze. His grip on the puppies tightened. The car idled for a long, tense moment. The driver's silhouette was barely visible through the frosted windshield. Then, the headlights turned off. James's pulse pounded in his ears. Whoever they were, they weren't leaving. But right now, the puppies were his priority. With one last glance over his shoulder, he threw open the door and rushed inside. James wasted no time. He grabbed an old laundry basket, lined it with thick towels, and carefully laid the puppies inside. They barely moved. A lump formed in his throat. He quickly ran to the kitchen and filled a pot with warm, but not hot, water, soaking a few rags before gently rubbing the puppies down. "Come on, little guys. Stay with me," he murmured, his voice thick with worry. One of the puppies, a small, golden-furred one, let out the weakest little whimper. James's breath caught. He grabbed a heating pad, wrapped it in a soft towel, and nestled it beside them in the basket. Then, he ran to his fridge, grabbing the emergency supply of goat's milk he had for stray rescues. He filled a small syringe and carefully brought it to the mouth of the golden puppy. "Come on, buddy. Just a little." At first, there was no response. Then, the tiniest tongue flicked out, lapping weakly at the milk. James let out a shaky breath. One by one, he tried with the others. Some were too weak to respond, their tiny chests rising and falling at an agonizingly slow pace. He refused to let panic take over. All he could do now was fight for them. So, he sat there, rubbing warmth into their frozen bodies, whispering soft encouragements, making sure none of them slipped away. Outside, the storm raged, and at the end of his driveway, the car still hadn't moved. An hour passed. The puppies were slowly stabilizing. At least the strongest ones were. The golden pup, along with two others, had begun to show signs of alertness. Their little tails twitched when he rubbed their backs, their paws flexing slightly against the soft towels. It was progress. But James had been doing this long enough to know that the weakest ones weren't out of danger yet. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. And then, a knock. His whole body went rigid. No one knocks at my door this late. Slowly, James stood. He grabbed a shotgun from behind the door, just in case, and peered through the curtain. A man stood on his porch, bundled in thick winter gear, his face partially hidden by the shadows of his hood. James's grip on the shotgun tightened. Another knock. Firm. Insistent. James inhaled sharply. Then, he opened the door. The cold rushed in, but James barely felt it, because now he could see the man's face. And more importantly, he could see the guilt in his eyes. The man hesitated, shifting on his feet. His voice was rough, uncertain. "I saw you pick them up." James didn't respond. The man swallowed hard, rubbing his hands together. I wasn't the one who left them there," he said quickly. "But I know who did." Silence. A tense, heavy silence. James stared at him, anger rising in his chest. "Then why didn't you stop them?" The man looked away. "I tried." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I swear I tried." James's jaw clenched. Inside, one of the puppies let out a weak whimper. The man flinched at the sound. Then, he did something James never expected. He reached into his coat and pulled out another puppy. James's breath caught. The tiny creature shivered violently, barely moving. "She was the runt," the man admitted. "I couldn't leave her out there." James stared at him. Then, without another word, he stepped aside and let him in, because tonight, the fight wasn't over yet. The moment James stepped aside, the man rushed in, clutching the tiny, half-frozen puppy against his chest. Snowflakes clung to the stranger's beard, melting as they hit the warmth of the cabin. His hands trembled as he carefully unwrapped the pup from his jacket and held her out. "She's not moving much," he muttered, voice tight with worry. "I try to keep her warm, but—" James took the tiny creature gently, his heart hammering as he pressed her against his chest. She was cold, colder than the others had been. Too cold. He didn't waste a second. Rushing to the basket where the others were huddled together, he grabbed another towel, wrapped the puppy tightly, and placed her near the heating pad. She barely reacted. James clenched his jaw. "Come on, little one," he whispered, rubbing warmth into her fragile body. The man, still standing by the door, shifted awkwardly. His expression was a mix of regret, guilt, and something else, something James couldn't quite place. Finally, James spoke. "Who?" The man hesitated. "What?" James turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto the stranger. "You said you know who left them out there." His voice was low, controlled, but his hands, still rubbing warmth into the puppy, betrayed his barely contained anger. "Who did it?" The man swallowed hard. "My brother." James's fingers tensed. The stranger rubbed a hand over his face, sighing heavily. "He breeds dogs," he admitted, voice thick with shame. "But when they're not the right color or the run of the litter, he gets rid of them." James's stomach churned. The storm outside suddenly felt like a distant hum compared to the raging fury building inside him. He left them to die in a snowstorm. James ground out, barely able to keep his temper in check. The man nodded, looking away. "I tried to stop him," he said, guilt heavy in his tone. "But he wouldn't listen. He loaded them into his truck and just dumped them." He exhaled shakily. "I followed him, but by the time I got there, he was already gone. I was too late." James's fists clenched. He wanted to track this man down, to teach him a lesson in cruelty. But right now, the puppies were the priority. He turned his attention back to the runt, still unmoving in the basket. The golden puppy, the strongest of the group, crawled weakly toward her, pressing his tiny body against hers. A flicker of something strange passed through James's chest. The golden pup nudged her gently, and then he started licking her face. James held his breath. The tiny runt shuddered. A single, weak whimper escaped her lips. James's heart lurched. "She's still fighting," the man whispered in awe. James exhaled slowly, his anger momentarily replaced by cautious hope. But there was still one problem. These puppies weren't out of danger yet, and neither was their mother. James turned back to the man, his expression dark. There was no mother out there. The stranger swallowed, nodding. "My brother kept her," he said quietly. "She's locked in his barn." James's jaw tightened. "She's still alive?" "Yes, but barely." The man hesitated before adding, "He doesn't feed her much." Said she was useless once the puppies were gone. James felt like he was going to be sick. Every fiber of his being told him to grab his truck keys, drive straight to that man's farm, and put an end to his cruelty once and for all. But right now, the mother dog didn't have time for revenge. She needed rescue. Now, James shot a glance toward the basket. The golden puppy was still pressed against the runt, nudging her every few seconds, refusing to let her slip away. James made his decision. "We're getting her." The stranger's eyes widened. "What?" James stood, already grabbing his coat. "If she's still alive, she needs to be here with them." He jerked his chin toward the basket. "If you're serious about making things right, show me where she is." The man hesitated, but then he nodded, and together they stepped out into the storm. The drive was tense. The snow had thickened, making visibility nearly impossible. The man, who had finally introduced himself as Ryan, gave short, clipped directions to his brother's farm. James barely spoke. His mind was focused entirely on the mother. Would she still be alive when they got there? Would she even have the strength to move? Or would it be too late? The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. After what felt like an eternity, they pulled up to the edge of the property. James cut the engine, gripping the wheel tightly. The barn loomed in the darkness, barely visible against the storm. A single light flickered near the entrance, casting eerie shadows against the snow-covered ground. James turned to Ryan. "Stay close," he muttered. "If he sees us—" "He won't," Ryan interrupted. "He's at the main house, probably passed out drunk." James nodded once. Then they moved. Snow crunched under their boots as they sprinted toward the barn, keeping to the shadows. James could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. They reached the door. Ryan pulled out a key, fumbling slightly with his frozen fingers before finally unlocking the latch. The door creaked open, and the moment they stepped inside, James froze, because there, chained to a post in the farthest corner of the barn, was the mother dog. Her ribs jutted out from her thin frame. Her fur was filthy, matted with mud and old blood. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now dull, lifeless. But then, she lifted her head, and the moment she saw James, she whimpered, a broken, desperate sound. James's chest tightened painfully. It was the same sound the puppies had made, a sound of pure, pleading desperation. Ryan rushed forward, cursing under his breath as he fumbled with the chain. "She's weak," he muttered. "We have to carry her." James didn't hesitate. Carefully, he knelt down beside her. The mother dog flinched at first, but when James reached out, when his hand gently brushed over her head, she melted into his touch. She was too tired to resist, too tired to fight. But James wasn't. "Let's go," he said firmly, lifting her frail body into his arms. And for the first time in who knew how long, she didn't resist. She just let him save her. The drive back felt longer. The mother dog lay curled in James's lap, barely moving. He could feel her shallow breaths against his arm, could see the slow rise and fall of her frail chest. But when they finally pulled into his driveway, when he carried her inside, past the warmth of the fireplace, toward the basket where her puppies lay, something changed. The moment he set her down, the golden puppy let out a high-pitched yip. James watched, heart pounding, as the tiny pup crawled toward her. The mother's dull eyes flickered with something, recognition. Then, she lifted her head. She sniffed the air, and the moment she saw them, she whined, a deep, aching sound. James barely had time to react before the puppies, too weak just hours ago, began to crawl toward her. One by one, they reached her, and for the first time in days, the mother licked them. And that was when James knew she was going to fight. For them, for herself, and for the love that had brought them home. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the cabin's wooden walls. Outside, the storm raged on, howling through the trees, but inside was quiet. The kind of quiet that holds fragile hope. James sat on the floor beside the basket, exhaustion weighing heavy on his bones. His hands were still trembling, not from the cold anymore, but from the sheer gravity of what had just happened. The mother dog lay curled in the soft blankets, her frail body barely strong enough to lift her head, but she was trying. For them. For her babies. The golden puppy had never left her side, his tiny body pressed against hers as if his warmth alone could heal her. The other puppies, weak but instinctively drawn to her presence, had slowly gathered around her, seeking the comfort they had almost lost forever. And then, she moved. James held his breath as she lifted her head, her eyes scanning the small, trembling bodies nestled around her. Her puppies, the ones she had thought were gone. She let out the softest, most broken whimper, a sound of relief, of grief, of overwhelming love. Slowly, painfully, she stretched her nose forward and nuzzled them, one by one. James swallowed hard, his vision blurring. "Come on, girl. Stay with them. Stay with us." Her tongue flicked out, licking each pup, weak but determined. She was claiming them again, reassuring them, letting them know Mommy was here. James released a shaky breath. For hours, he had fought against the icy grip of death. He had driven through a blizzard, battled the deepest fury he'd ever felt, risked everything to save these fragile lives. But this moment, right here, this was what made it worth it. But they weren't safe yet. The mother had barely eaten. She was weak, dangerously so, and James knew that she wouldn't survive the night without help. He turned to Ryan, who had been sitting silently by the door, watching with an expression torn between guilt and something else, something deeper. "She needs fluids," James muttered, "and real food, not scraps." Ryan nodded quickly. "I'll get some broth going." James moved toward the small medical kit he kept for rescues, pulling out a syringe filled with electrolytes. He hated forcing fluids like this, but the mother dog was too weak to drink on her own. "This might feel a little strange, sweetheart," he murmured as he carefully pushed the liquid into the side of her mouth. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she swallowed. James exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him. Step by step, she was fighting. Hours passed. The storm outside raged on, but inside, warmth fought back against the cold. Ryan had finally spoken, really spoken. He admitted that he had spent his whole life turning a blind eye to his brother's cruelty. He always said they didn't matter, Ryan whispered, staring into the fire. That they were just dogs. That if they weren't good for money, they were worthless. His voice cracked. I told myself I couldn't stop him. That it wasn't my problem. James didn't answer right away. Because what could he say to that? There was no excuse for what his brother had done. But maybe, just maybe, there was hope for Ryan. You did the right thing tonight, James finally said. That matters. Ryan didn't look convinced. But when he turned toward the basket, when he saw the golden puppy still curled against his mother, still alive because someone had chosen to care, his eyes softened. And James saw it. A change. Maybe small, maybe quiet, but real. And for now, that was enough. The sky had begun to lighten when James noticed it. At first, he thought he was imagining things. But then, the mother dog lifted her head. Fully. Not just a weak tilt. Not just a twitch. She lifted her head, blinked at James, and she tried to stand. James's breath caught. It was slow, unsteady, but she was trying. One shaky paw, then another. She stumbled, her frail legs trembling beneath her. James reached out instinctively, ready to catch her if she collapsed. But she didn't. Instead, she turned to her puppies and lay down properly this time, curling protectively around them. The golden pup let out a tiny, content sigh and nestled closer, and for the first time since James had found them, the mother dog truly looked at peace. James felt something break inside him. A knot of tension he hadn't even realized he was holding loosened. He had spent the whole night fighting for them. But now, she was fighting for them, too. And somehow, against all odds, they had made it. James finally let himself exhale. The puppies were safe. Their mother was alive. And as Ryan sat beside him, watching in quiet awe, James realized something else. Tonight wasn't just about saving them. It was about something bigger. It was about choosing compassion over cruelty, about standing up when no one else will, about the undeniable, unbreakable truth that every life, no matter how small, is worth fighting for. James glanced at the mother dog one last time. Her eyes, no longer empty, no longer lifeless, met his. And though she couldn't speak, she didn't have to, because James understood. And in that moment, he knew. She was thanking him. The morning light spilled through the frost-covered windows, casting a golden glow across the wooden floor. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in fresh snow. Pristine, untouched, a new beginning. James sat in a chair near the fireplace, a warm mug of coffee cradled between his hands. He was exhausted, physically, emotionally, but for the first time in what felt like forever, his heart felt light. Across the room, nestled in the basket beside the fire, the mother dog lay curled around her puppies. Her puppies. She had survived. They all had. James had stayed up most of the night watching over them, refusing to let his guard down until he was sure, until he could see, with his own eyes, that they were safe. And now, as the mother dog licked her golden puppy's tiny head, her eyes filled with a quiet, unwavering love, James knew they were going to be okay. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. The mother dog was still weak, and it would take weeks, maybe longer, for her to regain her strength. The puppies were fragile, their little bodies still recovering from the brutal cold. But they had a chance, and that was more than they had been given before. James had already called the vet, arranging for a full checkup for the mother and her pups. He had made a mental list of what they would need: nutritious food, supplements, vaccinations, warmth, and above all, love. Lots and lots of love. And James was ready to give them that. All of it. Ryan stood by the door, his hands shoved into his pockets. He had barely spoken since last night, and James could tell the weight of everything was still sinking in. James knew the feeling. The moment you realize that you could have done something sooner, that you could have stopped the suffering before it ever began. But regret didn't change the past. Only action could. You going to tell the authorities? James finally asked, breaking the silence. Ryan hesitated. Then, slowly he nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I have to." James studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of hesitation. But Ryan's eyes, they were different now. Not clouded with guilt, not weighed down by fear, but determined, resolute. James nodded. "Good, because men like Ryan's brother, they didn't get to keep getting away with this." A small sound broke James from his thoughts, a tiny, high-pitched whimper. He looked down. The golden puppy, the strongest of them all, was staring up at him with those same big, trusting eyes. James smiled softly. "Hey there, little guy." He reached down, gently scratching behind the pup's ears. The puppy leaned into his touch, tail wagging weakly. But then, to James's surprise, the golden puppy stumbled forward, right into his lap. James blinked. For a moment, he sat frozen, watching as the tiny ball of fur burrowed into his sweater, his body relaxed and warm. Then a soft sigh. Content. Safe. James's heart clenched. The mother dog lifted her head, watching. Their eyes met, and James could have sworn she understood. This puppy, he had made his choice. James swallowed past the lump in his throat and whispered, "Guess you're staying with me, huh?" The puppy didn't move, didn't even lift his head. He was already asleep. And just like that, James knew. This wasn't just a rescue. It was something bigger, a second chance, for all of them. Not long after, Ryan left, off to report his brother and face whatever fallout came next. James didn't know where life would take him after this, but he had a feeling Ryan would never be the same. Because once you open your eyes to cruelty, you can't unsee it. And once you choose to stand against it, you never go back. James watched from the porch as Ryan's truck disappeared down the snowy road. Then, with the golden puppy still curled against his chest, he turned back inside. Back to the warmth of the fire. Back to the mother dog watching him with eyes full of quiet trust. Back to the lives that had nearly been lost, but were now found. Safe. Loved. And as he sat down beside the basket, feeling the steady rise and fall of the little pup's breath against his heart, James understood the real lesson of that night, the one he would never forget. Sometimes the smallest lives are the ones that change us the most. And sometimes, a simple act of kindness can mean the difference between life and death, between despair and hope, between being abandoned and finally finding home.